This project is perfect for challenging your planning and problem solving skills, and best of all, it can be expanded to any card game you can think of. Let's get started now. If you're watching my channel, then odds are you love learning, which is perfect because today's video sponsor, Skillshare, has one of the largest learning communities with thousands of online classes which are crafted with the single goal of helping you become the best version of yourself. And you can do this through a wide range of topics, everything from web development to graphic design, UI, UX design, and even things such as music and productivity. I recently started taking the Productivity Masterclass by Thomas Frank, and it is incredible. The way he's able to sum up all of his points in such a short and concise manner means that I can immediately start taking away the points from his videos and making myself more productive the day that I watch the video, instead of having to go through 10-20 hours of content. Best of all, Skillshare is completely ad-free and coming out with classes all the time, which means that you can stay focused on learning without being distracted by anything else. And you can get it for less than $10 per month if you're on the annual plan. And if you're one of the first 1,000 people to use my link in the description below, you can get a free trial of Skillshare Premium, which is the perfect way to start learning your next skill. So I highly recommend you check out Skillshare. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now on the right hand side of our screen, we have the finished version of our product. It's pretty rough looking, but the purpose is to take a look at the JavaScript and not necessarily the CSS. And as you can see, we have two decks of cards, and I simulated the game War. And in this game, both players flip over a card. Whoever has the highest card, in our case the computer does, they're going to win and put all of the cards into their pile. Then you flip over again, whoever has the highest card wins and takes all the cards. And if you have a draw at some point where you have the same number, then you just both keep your card and put it back on the bottom of your own deck. And this goes around all the way until finally someone runs out of cards and they are the loser and the person with all the cards is the winner. It's a very straightforward game, but it brings about a lot of problem solving and planning skills around how you build out your deck and card classes and objects inside of JavaScript. So to get started with this, just like with pretty much any web development project, we need an HTML page. We're just going to create one called index.html, hit exclamation point and tab, and that's going to bring all this boilerplate HTML for us. If you're interested in learning how this works, check out my full video on Emmet. I'll link in the cards and description. That shows you exactly how to do that exclamation point trick, as well as a bunch of other tricks. We're going to just call this card game here. And then I also want to create another file called deck.js. And this is where all of the code for our deck and cards is going to go. But I want to have a different file which encapsulates the code for the actual script which runs the game War. Because we could build out this nice deck class and make it specific to the game War, or we could build out a more general deck class that allows us to expand this to any card game we can think of. So by creating a specific deck.js file, which contains all of our deck functionality, we can make sure that we expand this to any game we want and not just this particular game. So that means I'm going to create a separate script.js file, which is what I'm going to import into my file here. So script.js, make sure to defer that after my HTML loads. And then this is going to contain the logic for War. And then here, we're just going to do an import statement that imports the code from this deck here. So I want to make sure that I actually specify this with a type of module. And the reason I can delete the defer keyword is because modules automatically defer on their own. If we just save this, and inside a deck, we want to create our deck class. We'll just create a class called a deck. And inside of here, we'll have our constructor. And of course, our deck is going to contain some different variables. Really, the only thing we care about is cards. We'll say this.cards. For now, we'll set it to an empty array. So this is what our cards are going to be. And I actually want to pass these cards into the constructor because the cards could be anything. It could be a full deck of 52 cards, or in our case, we have two different decks of 26 cards, essentially one full deck split in half. So this deck class, I want to be flexible enough to both encapsulate a full deck of cards as well as, for example, someone's hand of cards, or maybe a pile of cards, a discard pile. Anything that deals with a pile of cards, we encapsulate inside of this deck class. Then let's create a class for each one of our cards. This is going to be fairly straightforward. A card has a suit, for example, spade, diamond, heart, and then it has a value, for example, 10 or 8. So this is going to have a constructor which takes in our suit and our value, and it just sets suit equal to the suit and value is equal to the value. So card, very straightforward, but deck is going to be a little bit more confusing. So the very first thing that I want to do is just create a full deck of 52 cards. So to do that, we need to get all of the different suits as well as all of the different values for each one of our cards. So we can create some variables. We'll just create a constant variable. We're going to call this suits, and I'm putting it in all caps to represent this as a global constant variable. It's essentially a static variable. This is going to be an array. We want to put all of our different suits inside of here. So we can actually just copy the suit itself as a character that we can paste into our editor. I'm just going to copy all of the suits over. You can get these by just Googling suits, HTML or suits font, or you could get them from the GitHub linked in the description down below. Either way, doesn't matter, but we just copy these in here like this. Then we're going to get our values, which we're going to, again, set to an array. And in here, we're going to have, for example, ace, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is really fun to watch, I'm sure. And Jack, Queen, and King. Now we have all of our different values, we have all of our different suits, and we can combine these together to create 52 unique cards. Let's just collapse this so it's not so big. And all the way at the bottom here, I'm just going to create a function called fresh deck. And this is going to create us a brand new deck of cards with all 52 cards, one for each suit and value combination. So inside of this function, what I want to do is I want to loop through all the suits, loop through all the values, and then combine them all together inside of one array. And a really easy way to do that is by using the map function as well as the flat map function. So let me show you. We're going to return suits.flatMap. We're going to loop through each one of our suits. And what flat map does is it works exactly the same as the map function inside of JavaScript, but it takes all of your arrays. So if we had, for example, values like this, it has an array inside of arrays. It just condenses all of those arrays into one array, so we'd be left with this instead. So instead of having an array of arrays, we just get one array with all the values flattened inside of it. So then what we can do in here is loop through all of our values, and we can map them into an array. So this is going to return an array of arrays, this flat map, but then it's going to condense it into one single array. And this is going to be for each one of our values. And all we do is create a new card with the suit and the value. And to show you how this works, I'm just going to set our cards by default equal to a fresh deck, because if we don't pass in a set limit of cards, for example, 26 cards or whatever, it'll create us a brand new deck of every single card. Now I want to export the deck class. Let's just make this the default export. So now what I can do inside of this script, I can import deck from ./deck.js. Let's just create a brand new deck. We'll call it deck equals new deck. We're not going to pass in any cards at all. Now what I can do is just open this up with live server. I'm going to open up on the right hand side of my screen. And if I just inspect this and pull over here, go to the console, and if we just type in, for example, console.log deck.cards. Now you can see we have an array with 52 cards, and each one has a suit and a value, and it does all the suits and all the values. As you can see, we have one of each card. If, for example, I didn't use this flat map here, and instead I just used normal map, you're going to see I now have 4 separate arrays of 13 each. Technically, this is still 52 cards, but they're not really formatted in a way we want. That flat map takes this array, these 4 different arrays of 13, and turns them into one array of 52. So that is why we're using flat map here instead of a normal map. And now we have that array of 52 individual cards. But if you're playing a game, you kind of want to make it so your cards are a little bit more random than, having all of the values in order. This is not a very fun game if you know exactly the order of every single card. So we need to create a simple function that's going to allow us to shuffle our deck. And I actually just want to put this on our deck class. We can just create a function called shuffle. And inside of here, all we want to do is take our cards and set it to a shuffled version of our cards. So we just want to loop around and move all of our cards around. And you may originally think that a good way to do this is using the sort function. We could say, for example, this dot cards, and what we want to do is sort them. So we could say dot sort, and we have here A and B, and then we would just return math dot random. This is essentially going to sort our cards if we just subtract this by 0.5, because half the time this is going to give us a number less than 0, half the time is going to give us a number greater than 0, which means it'll randomly sort our cards for us. The problem with this, though, is that the sort function is really meant to sort things in an actual order and not a random order. So this is actually going to not give us a perfectly randomized order. For our use case, this is probably fine, But in general, this is going to mean that some cards in our deck would more frequently appear in the same slot. So let's just imagine if we had a deck of 4 different cards and we had the Ace of Spades, Ace of Hearts, Ace of Clubs, and Ace of Diamonds. Well, the Ace of Spades maybe has a 30% chance of appearing in the first slot instead of the 25% chance that it would if it's random. That is the problem with this technique for sorting. You just really can't use random inside of the sort function. So instead, we need to write our own sorting function to make this 100% accurate. So in order to do that, we just need to create a simple loop through our cards, and then flip them with other cards inside of our array. So we can do a for loop where we start I equal to how many cards that we have. And instead of doing something like this .cards.length, length -1, which would give us the final index of our card, I want to instead encapsulate this .cards.length into its own getter, because this is something we need to commonly access, and having to write out this .cards.length every time is a little bit cumbersome. So I want to create a getter for the number of cards. And this is just going to return this .cards.length. Now what I can do here is just say this .number of cards, and this is going to give us the exact same value. So now we're starting out at the last index, so we're starting with our last card. What I want to do is I want to check while I is greater than 0, because we don't actually need to flip the final card. If we flip all of the cards in the deck except for the last one, eventually that one's going to get flipped around as well. We don't have to worry about flipping that. And then we're going to do I minus minus. Essentially, all we're doing is going from the back of our list of cards all the way to the front. And we're just constantly taking whatever card we're currently on and flipping it with another card that comes earlier in the deck that we haven't gotten to yet. So I can just say const new index equals, and what I want to do is get the new index for where I'm going to put this card. So I want to get a random index that is earlier in the deck of cards than where we currently are. So what I can do is take a random number, random. What I want to do is multiply this by the I here, which is our current index, plus 1. So essentially this is going to give us a placement inside of our deck that is somewhere else. So this math.random is between 0 and 1. So this is going to give us any number that is essentially an index that we haven't accessed yet inside of this loop. Then to make sure this is an integer, I'm just going to use math.floor here. And now this new index is some index. Let's say I right now is 30. This is going to be between 0 and 30, essentially one of the cards we haven't accessed yet. Then what I want to do is I want to flip the values at the new index with the current index. So to do that, we need to get the old value, essentially the value that is at our new index currently. So we can just say that is equal to this .cards of new index. This is going to be the card that is at this new index. And we want to now take the card that is at our I index and put it where our new index is. So we can say this .cards of new index is equal to this .cards of I. And then we can say this .cards of I is equal to our old value. All we've done here with this set of code is we got a random index that is before the current card we're on, and then all we did is swap the card that we're currently on with this new card that we just got. This old value is just an intermediary value because we overwrite new index here, so we need to have access to it before we overwrite it. All we're doing is looping through all of our cards and swapping them with another card. And this right here is going to give us a perfectly random shuffle every single time. So now what I can do is here, I can just say deck.shuffle. And now if I look at our console, we should see that we still have an array of 52 different cards, but they're completely shuffled. As you can see, the order of these is completely random. And if we were just to refresh our page, you can see we get now a brand new ordering that's completely random again. As you can see, there's absolutely no patterns or any distinguishing features. This is completely random, which is exactly what we want from a shuffle function. Now there's a bunch of additional functionality we can add to our deck, but before we start adding functionality that we maybe don't necessarily need, I want to move on to adding in some of the HTML that we have over here so we can really start rendering out our different cards and our different decks so we can start to see what functionality we need to add to our deck, because there's no point in making this massive deck class that has all the functionality in the world if we're never going to use any of it. So inside of this index.html, I want to start creating the HTML for our different game. And luckily this HTML is really straightforward. We have a pile of cards here and down here. We have the flipped card up here in the top right and in the bottom right. Then we have some text in the middle telling us whether or not we lost or won the flip of the card. So we really have 5 different elements. I'm just going to put them directly inside of the body, and we're going to use CSS grid to lay these different elements out. So we can just put them all inside of here on the same level of nesting. What I want to do is I want to do the computer deck, which is going to be our very first thing. So we're going to give it a class of computer deck, and we're going to give it a class of deck, just like this. And by default, since we're doing half a deck, this is going to say 26 in it. That's half of 52. I want to copy this for the player deck, and then in between these, we need to have our flipped up card for our computer. We're going to have our computer card slot. We're going to give that a class of card slot as well, so we can share this class between our computer and player card. And if we copy this down here, we now have our player card slot. That takes care of this top left and top right and bottom left and bottom right. The only thing we have left is this middle section, which is just our text. We'll just give it the class of text for now. So now if we save this, open this up with live server, you're going to see we just have 26 and 26. Pretty straightforward. And actually, we didn't even need to open it. It's already open right here. So now what I want to do is actually start styling out our different cards in the deck and all of that different stuff. So let's just look over here at what our styles are going to look like and create a simple styles.css, which we're going to link right here. So we're going to link a style sheet called styles.css. Now, inside of our styles.css, one of the very first things I like to do whenever I'm styling with CSS is just take my box sizing right here, box sizing, and set it to border box. And I like to do this for all the elements as well as all the pseudo elements. So for example, after and before, just like this. This just makes it so much easier to work with styling different elements. Once we have that done, the next thing I generally like to do is style our body. And I like to just get rid of those pesky margins on all the sides. So we can get rid of our margin here. So then what I want to use is grid in order to get our 5-section layout here. We have this 3-row layout and 2-column layout. So we're going to essentially say our display is grid. We're going to have grid template columns. And these columns are essentially just going to be a repeat 2 times of 4 rem. So now if we save this and come over here, you can see that we have that 2-column layout already showing up, which is great. Next thing I want to do is set up our rows. So we're going to say grid template rows. And here we have 3 different rows. We have the card row, the text row, and the card row. What I want to do is have 7 rem be for our card, 2 rem be for our text, and then 7 rem for our card again. Now if we save that, go over here, we now have those rows being shown as well. It's a little hard to tell because there's no styles being applied to these different sections, but you can see things are starting to get spaced out, which means these different columns and rows are showing up. Next, I want to add a little bit of a gap. We'll say 0.5 rem that just spaces out all of our different elements between each other. And finally, this is going to be a little bit weird, but I'm going to make a cursor pointer, which means we have this pointer cursor anywhere on our screen. And that's because no matter where I click on this screen, it's going to advance the game forward. So every time I click on the screen, it flips a card or puts the cards at the bottom of the deck. That's just the way I designed this game. You can do whatever you want for your game, so maybe you don't need this, but for this game, it works out perfectly. Now in order to center this on our screen, I just want to justify our content in the center, and I'm just going to put a little bit of a padding on the top. We're just going to use 1 rem. Now if I save that, you can see it's centered on our screen and moved it down a little bit from the top of the screen, just so it's easier to work with. Now the next thing that I want to style is the individual decks themselves. So we can just come down here and say deck, and our decks, I want to just set the height to be 100% and the width to be 100%, just so they fill the entirety of these columns and rows that they're inside of. And then in order to actually see what these decks look like, let's just give them a border, 1 pixel solid black. Now we can see we have that black border showing up. And you may be wondering why this 26 looks so weird. And that's because if we come over here to our index.html, this is in column 1, row 1, column 2, row 1, then we have row 2, column 1, and then row 2, column 2. We want this text, though, to span the entirety of both column 1 and column 2. If I put some text in here, you can see right now it's showing up next to our deck. We want it to span both of the columns. So to do that, let's just select our text. We're going to select our grid column, and we want it to span 2 rows, or 2 columns, I'm sorry. And now as you can see, it spans 2 different columns just like this. Also, if we wanted to center our text inside of these columns and rows, we could just change the display here to flex. We could change the justify content to center and the line items to center. And now our text is dead centered inside of its rows and its columns. And now our 2 decks are showing up like we want them to. The next thing I want to do is essentially the same thing. I want to center the text on our deck. So we're going to copy the exact same flex, center, center, and that'll center our text for us. And now I'm just going to increase the font size to 3 rem, so we have a much larger font. And I want to round the corners a little bit, so we're going to say border radius of 0.5 rem. Lastly, let's change the color here to white. And the reason for that is because we have a computer deck, which we're going to set the background color to green. And then we have a player deck, where we're going to set the background color to blue. And now, as you can see, our two decks look just like the two decks that we have over here. The one last thing that I want to do is you can see I can actually highlight the text on our deck. I actually don't want that, so I'm going to change user select to none, and that prevents me from highlighting the text on the deck because it's more of a part of a game and not really text you should highlight and copy and paste, so I don't want the user to be able to select that text. Now the next step is going to be rendering out an individual card. So what I want to do is just put a placeholder card in here for now. We're just going to hard code it, and then we're going to dynamically render this card later. But for now, for styling purposes, let's hard code this. So we're just going to make a div. We're going to give it a class of card. And inside of here, all I want to do is put the suit of the card. So if we come over here, you can see we have a 9 of hearts. I would want to put the heart symbol right here. So if I just come into our deck, we can copy the heart symbol, paste that into our HTML. So now, if I come over here, you can see we have the heart showing up. So I want to be able to render our card, and in this case, a heart should be red. So let's give it a class of red. We're going to either use the class red or black to determine the color of the card, but this one should be red because it is a heart, as you can see here, and those are red inside of a normal deck of cards. Also, I want to have the value of my card show up in these corners, and I could do that by creating, a div and absolutely positioning it like this, but I'm going to actually use before and after elements, and you can use a data attribute. For example, we can say data value, set that equal to 9, and I can actually access this data value inside of my CSS. And if you want an entire blog article on exactly how to do this, I'm going to link it down in the description below. It'll go over exactly how you can use data attributes in CSS, but I'm also going to show you in this video. So next thing, now that we have all this done, I want to move into our styles. We'll just scroll down to the bottom here. We can select our card, and we're going to have a card that has a before element and a card after element. And then I also want to combine those selectors. So we're going to have a card before and a card after, because really our before and after element are very similar. You can see they both contain almost the exact same code inside of them. And actually, as you can see, this is 9 and the heart symbol. So our value here should be 9 with the heart symbol, not just 9 on its own. So now instead of our CSS, for our card, let's start here. The first thing I want to do is I want to set the height to 100%. And I want to set the width to 100%. And let's get that border on here of 1 pixel solid black with that border radius of 0.5 rem. Now, if I come over here, you can see we have our card showing up, and I want to center that font. So again, we can just use Flexbox for this. Just copy this over, save that, and change our font size to be 4 rem. It's going to give us a nice big heart right in the middle, just like we have over here. So this is essentially the main bulk of our center card setup. The next thing is going to be our before and after element. And to position them inside of our card, we're going to give our card a position of relative. So when we absolutely position our before and after element, we can do it based on where our card is positioned. So now what I want to do inside of here is I want to come in and I want to put our content equal to attr. This allows us to access any data attribute, and the data attribute we want is data value. Immediately, when I save this, you're going to see the 9 of hearts are showing up. And if I shrink down that font size back to a normal 1 rem, you can see we have the 9 of hearts and the 9 of hearts showing up in both of these different sections, before and after. And if we just change the position here to be absolute, now what we can do, you can see it disappeared because it's right in the middle of our heart here, so it's not showing up. If I change the color to white, you can see it showing up over top. What we need to do now is position these. So we're going to put the before element in the top left, so 0.5 rem away from the top and the left. As you can see, that's now in the top left. And what we want to do for our after is we want to put this in the bottom, and we want to put it in the right. And what we want to do is make sure this flips upside down, because in a normal deck of cards, it's essentially reversed, it's mirrored. So what we want to do is just take our transform, and we want to translate this 180 degrees. Essentially, it's going to flip itself upside down. And this should actually be rotate, not translate. I don't know what I was thinking, but when I save that, you can see that this 9 has now flipped upside down, and this looks like a normal deck of cards. The last thing that I want to do is get our card.red and change the color to red. And I want to get our card.black. I want to change the color to black. Just like that. So now we can have a black card or a red card. So if we, for example, come in here, change this to say black, you can see the card shows up in black, and is red, it shows up in red. The final thing I want to do here is just put a space between the 9 and the heart. I think that looks a little bit better. It was a little cramped before, so now if we just add that space, it gives us a little bit of a better appearance, in my opinion. And if we copy this down to over here, we can kind of see what this game looks like when we have two different cards being shown, some text in the middle, and the numbers for the different values for the number of cards in the deck. So we really have all of the HTML we need, all the CSS we need. The next step is going to be working on the actual JavaScript. And the first thing I want to do is work on the JavaScript that's going to allow us to dynamically render out a card. So I want to copy this HTML and we're going to move it into deck.js because I want our card to have a function called getHTML. And this is going to return to us an HTML element. And this HTML element, I want to look just like this. Let's just essentially create an HTML element that looks like this. We want to get our element. We're just going to call it card div. And it's going to be document.createElement of a div. Then we want to take our card div, and I want to take our inner text and set it equal to this.suit, since we have that as our text inside of the card. And this should be spelled correctly. There we go. Then I want to take our card div, I want to get our class list, and I want to add a class here. And this first class I want to add is going to be card. And then I want to get the color for this card. And I could do the calculations in this function for that, but I just want to create a simple getter for color. And inside of here, all I want to do is I want to check if this .suit is equal to, and I want to check to see if it's equal to either the club, in our case, or if it is equal to a spade. So I come in here, then we return black. Otherwise, we return red. So we have a simple ternary operator that is going to be returning black if it's either of these two suits, or it's going to return red if it's not one of those suits. So then what we can do is just add the classes of our color, which in our case is black or red, and a card. So now that takes care of this portion, takes care of this portion, so our classes are done, our value in the middle is done. The last thing is our data attribute. We can say card div data set dot, what is it called, value equals, and what we want to do, just do some string interpolation. We want to get our this dot value, and we want to get this dot suit. This HTML right here is essentially the same as the HTML down here. So if we return our card div, we now have access to that HTML. I just need to get rid of this keyword function here because it's inside of a class, so it already knows it's a function. Remove this HTML, and now we have the ability to get the HTML for any one of our cards. And what I want to do inside of script.js is let's just get access to this computer card slot. So I'm just going to copy this class here. I just want to say const computer card slot equal to document.query selector for the class computer card slot. And then I want to take the computer card slot and I want to set an element inside of it. So we're going to append a child, which is deck.cards. We'll just get the very first one and we'll get the HTML from that card. So now if I save, you can see this doesn't quite look 100% correct. So let's see exactly what the problem is. We can just inspect this to see what's going on here. And you can see we have two cards inside of this div. So what I really need to do is in our HTML, remove this initial card that shouldn't be there. So now if I save, you can see we're getting a random card, the first card in our deck showing up right here. And every time when I refresh our page, we're getting a brand new card. And it's properly showing based on the color, value, and the suits exactly like we want. Now let's take this a step further. Let's actually start making this work like a game and not just a fancy visualization of some random classes we created. So inside of our script.js, I just want to create a function. This function is going to be called startGame. And what I want to do is just call this function right away. So we're going to call startGame immediately. And in here, I want to create a new deck. I want to shuffle the deck so we have a random ordering of cards. And then I want to split this into two equal piles of cards. Easiest way to do that is to get the midpoint. So we'll say deck midpoint. This is going to be equal to math.ceil. And all we want to do is take the number of cards in our deck and we want to divide by 2. And the reason we have math.ceil here is if for some reason we had a deck of 51 cards, we're going to essentially convert whatever we divide 51 by 2, which is 25.5. That'll be converted to 26. So one deck is going to have 26 cards and the other has 25. In our case, 52 divides perfectly by 2, so we don't have to worry about that rounding error. But just in case, we have this put here. Next, what I want to do is I want to get our player deck and our computer deck. And I want to make these variables that are global so they're accessible everywhere. We're going to say player deck and deck and computer deck. So we just created some empty variables for our player and our computer. And then I want our player to get the first 26 cards in our deck. So what we can do is we can take our deck, deck.cards. And what I want to do is I want to slice off the cards from 0 to the midpoint. This is going to give us the first 26 cards. And I want to create a new deck from these cards. I want to do the exact same thing for our computer deck, so I'm just going to copy this down. But instead, I want to start at the midpoint and I want to end at the last card. So deck.number of cards. This is going to give us the last 26 cards in the deck. Then we can just log these out. So we can say player deck, and we're also going to log out our computer deck. So let's just see what happens. If we inspect our page, go to the console, we get an error, uncaught reference deck is not defined. That's just because right here, we're not having a deck referenced anymore. So now what we can see is we have two different decks. We have 26 cards in this one and 26 cards in this one. So we essentially have two perfectly even decks of the original deck just split in half between our computer and our player. So now what I want to do is I essentially want to call a cleanup function. This cleanup function is going to set up all the values for our information. We're going to have that 26 show up, our text is going to clear itself, these different card slots are going to clear themselves. Essentially, this is an intermediary step. Remember over here when we click and everything resets, that's the step that I want to emulate. When we start our game, we want to be in this initial default state. I'm just going to call this clean up, or we'll say clean before round. There we go. And we're just going to create a function called clean before round. And you could do all this code inside a start game. It's just easier if we separate this out. And what we want to do in here is we want to select all these different elements. So we want to come over to our index.html. We want to get our computer deck. We'll bring that over. We'll say const computer deck equals document.query selector of computer deck. We're going to get the player deck as well. We're going to get the player card slot, just like this. And we also need our text. So we'll say text, and this is going to say text. And this should be player deck element and element because we already have a player deck and computer deck variable. Now, instead of our cleanup, what we can do is we can take our text and we just want to set it to an empty string. So we'll say inner text is blank. We want to take our computer card slot and clear it out. So we'll say computer card slot dot inner HTML equals blank. I want to do the exact same thing for our player as well. And then finally, I want to update the count for our cards. So we're just going to do that in a function. We'll say update deck count. Function update deck count. And this function is really straightforward. We're going to take our computer deck element. We're going to take the inner text and we're going to set it equal to our computer deck dot number of cards. We're going to do the exact same thing with our player deck and here player deck number of cards. And essentially now we have our cleanup before round completely done. If I save this, go to our index.html, and we're just going to delete all these placeholder values. You should see that when we run our page, come over here, it still populates this value of 26. And that's because each one of the decks currently contains 26 cards. If instead we were to change this inside of our script, and here instead of going to our midpoint, we just went to 3, now you'll see that we only have 3 cards inside of this deck because it only goes from 0 to 3. Let's just save this again. So now we have 26 in each one of these decks. So now what I want to do, we have our start game ready. We have our cleanup between rounds. What I want to do is start making it so we can click to flip between different rounds. So let's just come all the way to the top here. It really doesn't matter where, but we'll do it up here. We'll say document.add event listener on click. Because remember when we click anywhere on the screen, we want to run this function. And inside of this function, essentially I want to be able to switch between clicking to flip a card and clicking to hide a card. So I need a variable to do that. We're just going to call this variable in round. We're going to set it equal to false. And in round means that the card is currently flipped right now because we're in the middle of a round. So what I want to do in round, set to false by default. And when I start the game inside of here, we're just going to say in round equals false. Because by default, we start out in this state. So really, in round, we could just put up here. We don't even need to give it a default value because we're defaulting it whenever we start our game. So if we are in a round, then what we want to do is clean up that round. So we're going to say clean before round. Then otherwise we need to flip our card. So we're going to say flip cards, which is a new function that we're going to create. Function flip cards. Now inside of here, what we need to do is first set in round to true because we're now in the middle of a round. And here in our clean, we need to set in round to false. Move that to the top because now we're no longer in a round. So this allows us to flip between what our different click function does for us. And now inside of here, what we need to do is get the top card from the deck. Well, we're going to create a function to do that, and we're going to call it pop. So we're going to say const player card equals player deck dot pop. This is going to give us the first card. Do the same thing for our computer. Now what we can do is render these cards. So we can say player card slot dot end child, and we're going to append the child of player card dot render, get HTML. And then we can do the same thing with our computer card and our computer card slot. So now we just need to make this pop function work. So when I save, you're going to notice nothing happens because we don't have a working pop function. So inside of our deck, we want to create a function called pop, and we want this to return the top card from our deck. So we can just say return, this.cards.shift. And what shift does is it takes the top element, essentially the first element in our array, it takes it off and returns it to us. Pop, if we did this.cards.pop, this actually returns to us the last element inside of the array. In our case, we want the top element, so we're going to use shift. While we're here, I also want to add a function called push, which adds a card to the bottom of our deck. So we're going to say this.cards.push card, and we're going to pass in the card to push here. So push adds an element to the end of the array, so that's perfect with our push method. They both do the exact same thing, but with pop, we need to use shift because we want to take from the top of the deck and not very much the bottom, because pop takes from the bottom. So now save that, and we can come over here and we can click, and you can see it actually flips the top card for us. So this is the top card in each one of the decks flipped over for us. Right now, if we click again, it'll go back, flip, and then it'll flip the next one. It'll get rid of it, flip the next one, next one, next one, next one. But right now, we're not checking any winners. We're not adding the cards to the bottom of the deck, so eventually they're all going to run out of cards, which is not good. So the first thing that I want to do, if we just refresh this and flip, you'll notice this card count doesn't actually change. I want to make sure that's updated. So we're going to call update deck count. Now when I flip, you'll see these decks both contain 25 cards because they started with 26, but one of them is over here now. So that's perfect. Now, once that's done, I want to check to see who won the round. So we can just create a function called isRoundWinner, which is going to take in card 1 and card 2 and determine which one is the larger of the two. In our case, 6 is greater than 2, so the person with card 6 would win. It's pretty straightforward when we're using numbers to compare, but what happens when we have a jack versus a 2? A J doesn't really have any meaning, so we need to be able to convert from these numbers here, for example, jack or the string 2 or ace, and figure out which one is the largest. To do that, I'm going to create a simple constant variable called the card value map. And this is just going to be an object which maps between our values, in our case, for example, 2, or we have jack, and I want to convert these to a number. So 2 is going to convert to the number 2. Just copy this down a bunch of times because we have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and these just straight up convert over to their number version, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And jack, well, this is going to be larger than a 10, so it's going to convert to 11. We're going to have queen, that converts to a 12. King is next, that converts to a 13. And finally, we have our ace, which is the largest number, so we're going to convert that to 14. So now we can map from our value, which is a string, over to a number and compare them to see which one is largest. So we can just come all the way down here. We can say that we just want to return our card value map for card1.value to see if it is greater than the card value map from card2.value. Essentially, all we're doing is getting the value of card 1, getting its actual numeric value, and seeing if it's larger than the value for card number 2. If so, card number 1 is the winner. We can say if isRoundWinner of player card versus computer card. This right here means that the player has won. If the player wins, I'm just going to take the text.inner text and I'm going to set it to win. So now we should see that if I click here, and this is a lose, so if I wait until I find a winning card, as you can see 10 is greater than 6, so it says win. And also on top of that, I want to add these cards to the bottom of the player's deck. So I can just say player deck.push. I want to push the player card, and I want to push the computer card, because when you win, you take the other person's card. Now that we have this scenario complete, what happens if the computer wins? It's actually very similar. We're going to add another else if statement in here, checking if the computer card is the winner versus the player card. If that's the case, we put the text lose here. And what I want to do is I want to take the computer deck and I want to add the player card and the computer card to it. Then finally, we're going to have an else statement where there's a draw. Just copy all this. And we want our text to say draw. we want the player card to go into their own deck and the computer card to go back in their deck. So now, if I flip, you can see this is a lose because the computer has more cards. When I click again, both the cards got added to their deck. Flip again, we won, so now both the cards add to our deck. Continue on like this, and now as you can see, we have 28 cards and they have 24 cards. So now our game is essentially nearly finished, but what happens when someone completely runs out of cards? That means that they lose. We need to check for that. So we can say if is game over of the player deck. So has the player lost? Let's create this is game over function. Is game over, and it's going to take in a deck. And all this does is return if the deck has no cards. So deck.number of cards is equal to 0. That means that you lose. If that's the case, our text should now just say you lose. A couple exclamation points to really rub it in. And we're going to set a variable here called stop to true because we don't want the game to continue after someone won. So up here, let's create that stop variable. And down here, we're going to set stop default to false. So now if stop is true, wherever our click function is here, we can say if stop is true, then we just want to restart our game. So we're going to say start game. And then I just want to return, that way we don't run any of this code. So whenever we click, if someone has already won, then we're going to restart the game from the beginning to do another game. Now let's scroll back down here. Let's put in an else. We want to do an else if to see if the winner here is instead the actual computer, or the loser, I'm sorry, computer deck to see if they're the loser. And if the computer loses, well then you win. And stop should still be true. So now if I save that, it's going to be a little difficult to check this because we have to go through all these cards. So instead what I'm going to do is just kind of make the computer really bad. I'm just going to, instead of giving them a whole deck of a bunch of cards, I'm going to give them a deck with one single card in it. So we're going to say new card, and this new card is going to have a suit. We're just going to give it a suit of S. It really doesn't matter, and it's going to have a value of 2. That's the important thing. And then what we need to do is just make sure we import card up here, and we need to make sure we export card from our deck. This is just temporary, just for the testing purposes. But now you can see they have one card and it's a 2, so they should automatically lose. We click this, it says you win. We click again, and it resets the game back with them having one card, having 26, and again we won. And now we drew here because both of us have a 2, so it goes back, and now we won, so it resets the game for us. We can make this a little bit more apparent by giving them 2 cards instead of just 1. So down here, let's just copy this. Whoops. Giving them a new card. I'm going to do S and a 2 again. So now you can see we won, added the card to our deck, won again, and now we reset the game. Obviously, though, we don't want the computer to have 2 terrible cards, so we're going to save this. We're going to get rid of this card export. And in our deck, we don't need to export card, so there we go. And that's all it takes to create this card game. And if you enjoyed this video, then you're going to love my complete JavaScript course, which covers everything you need to know about JavaScript. I'm going to link that down in the description below, so make sure you check that out. Thank you very much for watching this video, and have a good day.